What is going on, guys? We're back at it again, right here. PapaReys Boom Boom Room. Starting with the stardoms, sit-ems, weekly picks, and fantasy football. Best time of the year, playoff basketball. My Celtics went down 3-1 last night. Lakers play today. Hopefully they go up 3-1. Man, I did not want this matchup for my Celtics. We do not have a good center, and obviously Bam is destroying us. But let's do an NFL recap from last week. If you guys saw my pick'ems, I got 14 out of 16 correct. The Saints lost, and the Jags lost. Week 2, Cleveland 35 over Cincinnati 30. Pittsburgh 26, Denver 21. Buffalo won 31-28 versus Miami. Baltimore won 33-16 over Houston. Dallas Cowboys came back big and beat the Atlanta Falcons 40-39. Green Bay destroyed Detroit 42-21. Indianapolis destroyed Minnesota 28-11. Minnesota is miserable. The New York Giants lost 13-31 versus San Francisco, although San Francisco lost a lot of huge important players. LA Rams 37, Philadelphia 19. Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Denver Broncos 26-21. They also lost Drew Lock in that game. Tampa Bay 31, Carolina 17. The Tennessee Titans beat the Jacksonville Jaguars 33-30. Chicago over the Giants 17-13. Arizona smashed Washington 30-15. Kansas City came back 23-20. Justin Herbert looked great in his first start, with Tyrod Taylor having a punctured lung thanks to the team doctor trying to give him a shot for a cracked rib. Seattle over New England 35-30. And Las Vegas, with their first home game in that new beautiful stadium, beat the New Orleans Saints without Michael Thomas 34-24. Alright, so this week, quarterbacks to start. I would start Cam Newton versus the Raiders. I would start Big Ben versus Houston. I would start Gardner Minshew versus Miami tonight. I would start Tom Brady versus Denver. And I would start Ryan Tannehill versus the Vikings. The Vikings, like I said, are miserable. And Ryan Tannehill has really showed up. I thought this was just a fluke going from last year. Didn't think they would do it again, but they're doing pretty nice. Quarterbacks I'd sit Carson Wentz against the Bengals. Bengals defense is well improved. Although, I don't know, maybe the Eagles will win, but I don't think it'll be on the back of Carson Wentz. I would sit Sam Darnold versus the Colts. I would sit Jared Goff versus Buffalo. I would sit Baker Mayfield versus the Washington football team. And I would sit Deshaun Watson versus Pittsburgh. My sleeper picks for quarterback this week: Justin Herbert, if Tyrod Taylor, I'm assuming, is out. Justin Herbert had a great first career game, and I look for him. If he does start, pay attention. If Justin Herbert starts, I'd start him against the Panthers. Matthew Stafford versus Arizona as a sleeper, and Joe Burrow versus Philadelphia as a sleeper. Moving on to running backs. James Robinson, new running back for the Jags, starting to take over. Looked real nice the past 2 weeks. I would start him over Miami. James Conner is looking, I don't know. James Conner, I would start him versus Houston, but James Conner has failed me in the past. That Chubb Hunt duo, I would start versus the Washington Reds football team. Leonard Fournette looks to be taking the throne in Tampa, and I would start him versus Denver without Von Miller. And I would start Austin Eckler versus the Carolina Panthers. Running backs to sit. I would sit Todd Gurley versus Chicago. He did have a good game last week. I don't think he'll follow it up, though. I would sit Antonio Gibson against Cleveland. Sit David Johnson against Pittsburgh. I would sit Ronald Jones versus Denver, as I think Fournette's going to start taking over those touches. And I would sit Dion Lewis versus San Francisco. My sleeper picks for running backs: Myles Gaskin, that new running back for the Miami Dolphins versus Jacksonville tonight. Jerick McKinnon, I would start him versus the Giants. They have a few injured running backs there in San Francisco, and Jimmy Garoppolo's out, so I would think that would depend on the run game and the short passing games with tight ends and whatnot. Let me see, sleepers. Rams running back Henderson with Akers and Brown hurt. I would look to maybe as a sleeper pick start Henderson. I know I'm starting him in one of my leagues against Buffalo. They're missing Tremaine Edmonds and their other linebacker. I would also pay attention to that because if they're back in the game, that might be something you might not want to go towards. Other sleeper, Christian McCaffrey's out, so Mike Davis versus the Chargers. Also sleeper, Melvin Gordon looking pretty nice, and I'm looking for him to be a sleeper against the Bucks. Wide receivers to start. Mike Evans starting to get into a groove with Tom Brady against Denver. Kenny Galladay making his first appearance this season versus Arizona. Julian Edelman started to make a connection with Cam Newton versus Las Vegas. Keenan Allen continuing to roll, especially if Herbert's in there versus Carolina. Corey Davis and or Adam Humphries versus the Vikings. Like I said about 3 times, the Vikings are miserable. And I would start DK Metcalf versus the Cowboys. I look for that to be a high-scoring game with a lot of big plays. So that's a pick to watch out for. Sits. I would sit Cooper Kupp versus the Bills. Will Fuller versus the Steelers. Sammy Watkins will be back this week, but I will sit him versus the Baltimore secondary. Jerry Jeudy, I would sit him versus Tampa Bay. New quarterback, and he's going to have to take that number 1 slot now that Cortland Sutton is also out for the season. And Marquise Brown, I would also sit him versus Kansas City, and that kind of hurts. I look for him to make big plays, but that's it. He's big play dependent, so there should be a lot of big plays there, but I would sit Marquise Brown. But also as a sleeper, I might put in Marquise Brown, because who knows. Also a sleeper, Terry McLaurin for Washington versus the Browns. CeeDee Lamb versus Seattle. Darius Slayton versus San Francisco. Keenan Cole or Laviska Shenault versus Miami tonight. Deshaun Jackson with this guy. He's hurt versus Cincinnati. Tight ends. Last week I had Jonnu Smith as a sleeper. I probably should have had him as a starter because he went off last week. Look for him to go off against Minnesota. Tyler Higbee also went off for 3 touchdowns last week. Don't think he'll have 3 touchdowns, but I feel like he'll have a good game against the Bills, especially, like I said, if they don't have their linebacking core. Noah Fant, he's going to be the security blanket for that new quarterback coming in for the Denver Broncos against the Bucks. Jared Cook versus Green Bay, the only standstill, especially if Michael Thomas is still out. And Mike Gesicki, who took advantage of the Bills not having their linebackers and went off last week against the Bills. Look for him to have a great week against Jacksonville. My sits, Chris Herndon. Anybody on the Jets, really. Jets are struggling. Adam Gase needs to get out of there so they can start building a new team and just make Sam Darnold look good. I would sit Chris Herndon against Indiana. Sit Dalton Schultz versus Seattle. Sit Jordan Reed versus the Giants. I think Kittle's coming back. I would sit TJ Hawkinson versus Arizona. And Gronk is not Gronk. I would sit Gronk. Honestly, you could drop Gronk until he shows that he's back in the game. Sleeper picks for tight ends: Evan Ingram versus San Francisco, O.J. Howard versus Denver, and Sample versus the Browns. Now that I don't even know how C.J. Uzama is out. Kickers and defense. Kickers, I would start Harrison Butker versus the Ravens. Blankenship versus the Jets. Young Hoku versus the Bears. Chris Boswell versus the Texans. And Mason Crosby versus New Orleans. Kickers, I would sit Tyler Bass versus the Rams, Joey Sly versus the Chargers, Dan Bailey versus Tennessee, Brandon McManus versus the Bucks, and Graham Gano versus the 49ers. Defenses to start: Bucks versus Denver, San Francisco versus the Giants, Chargers versus the Panthers, Titans versus Minnesota, and Steelers versus the Texans. Defenses I would sit: Saints and Green Bay. I would both sit them, high scoring game. I would sit Ravens and Kansas City. This is the only time I would say that this year, only because this game is going to be really high scoring and those defenses points are not going to show. Seattle I would sit versus the Cowboys, and the Vikings I would sit versus the Titans. The Vikings defense is not the same, as you can see. So those are my stardom, sit-ems, and sleepers for week 3 of this NFL season. Here are my week 3 picks. Last week I did good. Hopefully this week I also do good. I'm going to give Miami their first win over Jacksonville tonight. I got the Buffalo Bills over the Rams. That's going to be tough. Atlanta over Chicago. Cleveland over Washington. Tennessee over Minnesota. New England over Las Vegas. San Francisco over the Giants. Cincinnati over Philadelphia. Pittsburgh over Houston. Indianapolis over the Jets. The Chargers over the Panthers. The Cardinals over the Lions. The Buccaneers over the Broncos. Seattle over the Cowboys. Green Bay over New Orleans. And I'm going to say Baltimore over Kansas City. I seen how Kansas City started against the Chargers. I know they came back and won by a field goal in overtime, but I don't think the Baltimore D is going to let up like the Chargers defense did and let Patrick Mahomes back in the game. So, some juicy games this week. I hope you guys enjoy watching football, watching basketball. Whoever watches hockey, I think they're in the Stanley Cup now. It's just a great time to be a sports fan. If you guys haven't already, go ahead and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow on Facebook. I'm very active morally on Instagram. Barely on Twitter, but if you want to, go ahead and follow me on Twitter for fantasy advice. I want to thank you guys for listening in, tuning in every week on this podcast, and I hope you guys have a blessed day. And remember, if you guys win some money because of these picks, I need some of that, and I'll give you my Cash App. Y'all have a blessed day, y'all.